So what we'll do is we'll make a start, and let me introduce myself. My name is Marc McLaren. I'm the Director of Generative HSE, and we're going to spend about 45 minutes just running through some of the principles of mindful safety leadership. And they've really been developed probably over the last decade and a half, and I want to recognise a person who's on the conference today but won't be joining in just because of the technology limitations, and his name is Dr. Chris Darling, and Chris is based in Melbourne, and a number of you might know that Chris for well over a decade led the health and safety team at BlueScope Steel. So what I want to share with you is really a lot of the experiences that we've learnt in working with organisations in improving their health and safety performance, also out of the research that's been done, and I'll share a bit of that as we go. So what I want to do first is just really draw our attention to this notion of mindfulness, and certainly it's an area that has attracted a lot of attention outside of the safety discipline in terms of psychology, education, dealing with learning processes. So what Chris and I have done is looked at the fundamental issue about what does a leader really focus on? What is it the thing that takes their awareness and their energy? And there are probably three things we want to draw your attention to. We'll go back and we'll just go. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to, and often this is overlooked, is really what is working well. If we think about an incident happening in our workplace, the likelihood of that is probably to the power of -10. So it's fairly infrequent. And the problem is if we take a incident-only focus in our leadership, we actually lose the opportunity to learn from what it is that we're doing well. Following on from that is the notion of being mindful of when and why work is difficult to do. Part of the problem is we often see safety in a bubble, or we see it in isolation, and we don't view it as the whole picture. And so what can happen is there are a raft of things that make work difficult to do, and another way of describing that is the notion of performance variability. And so we're going to be mindful as an effective leader. We need to really grasp an understanding of that variability, particularly from the perspective of the person who is actually doing the job. And then the third part of mindfulness is really focusing on what it is that could go wrong. And so the first two principles come, if you've been reading lately, really come from the work of a guy called Professor Eric Hollnagel. And he very much has piloted that work and trying to shift safety from a safety one perspective that he's described as primarily being protective safety to a safety two view, which is really about how do we take a view of safety that's about being productive. And then obviously a number of you will be aware of the work of people like Carl Week and Andrew Hopkins, which has really come out of this thinking about being a high reliability organisation. And the focus there has been on, I suppose the way it's been described is a preoccupation with failure. So in a sense it's anticipating prior to something going wrong. And so really the leader who's going to be effective in safety needs to have that triple mindfulness. So firstly, it's about what is it being done well, a mindfulness about what can go wrong, and in the middle of that is when is work difficult and why is it difficult, and in particular, what do people do in that space? It was interesting, I was with a group of frontline supervisors yesterday, and I asked them that question, and their immediate response was, Mark, shortcuts. So, you know, we know that, so it's really about then focusing on how we move through that. So then I suppose I want to just really draw our attention to, because there's certainly been a lot of debate about the importance of safety culture and climate. And I want to suggest to you that as an effective mindful safety leader, what we're going to be looking at is this notion of how to build a climate or culture. The reality is that the leader cannot be present 24/7 and managing what's taking place. So it's how does that work team take account for its own performance? And interesting, and some of you who might have heard me talk recently, what's really caught my attention was a construction of a major tunnel, artificial island and bridge from Copenhagen in Denmark to Malmö in Sweden. I mean, this had been considered for probably, from the research I can understand, at least 100 years. There'd been this debate about how could they connect a 16-kilometre Øresund sound between Denmark and Sweden. And there are a number of obstacles in doing that, none the least having an international airport on the waterfront at Copenhagen. So what happened was the two governments came together, they formed a compact back in 1991 to build this structure. And it was opened on the 1st of July 2000. A remarkable achievement. And I thought I might just show you a little bit of footage, because what came out of it was a great piece of learning for mindful safety leadership, because it focused on something that really took people by surprise, because it actually created a natural experiment. So let me just show you a piece of this. It only gets played for a minute, so hopefully if you've got your sound on, I appreciate you might be sitting in your office and you might have your sound down, but you'll at least see the footage just to try and get an idea of the scale of this.
When you're 10 years old,
So yeah, you'd sort of accept that quite a remarkable thing. And what's interesting is that the Danes and the Swedes sort of share an interesting relationship, a bit like Australia and New Zealand. And for those who are familiar with the Muppets, you'll see there the Swedish chef. And there's the friendly rivalry between the two nations, a bit like us over football with New Zealand. And if you want to upset a New Zealander, I'm not quite sure we've got anyone from New Zealand, is when you want to suggest that they are really an extension of Australia. And I ain't going there this afternoon, by the way. But so what happened was in 1997, there was some really interesting discoveries. What they had is they had a concrete casting factory in Sweden and one in Denmark as part of the construction. And as you just saw the footage there, a huge amount of prefab concrete slab was used in the construction of the tunnel, the artificial island and the bridge. And so what happened in 1997, they closely monitored performance around incident and injury, and this is what they found. This is what they found. Quite remarkable. You'll see there on the left-hand side, the darker green slab, that was their all injury rate. That was everything from a lost time injury through to a first aid. And that was for the Swedes in Sweden. If you have a look at the light green, the middle bar, you'll see Swedes in Denmark, and then you'll see the Danes in Denmark, by a factor of 4. And that really began, I suppose, a questioning about what was different. And when they looked closely at what was different, they found that there were more things that were similar rather than different. So they were using the same equipment, the the same materials, they were following the same procedures, they were operating similar hours, and the Danes were working side by side with the Swedes in Denmark itself. So one of the things that led to the discovery was this. It was really about an understanding that safety climate fundamentally was the determining factor that made a difference. And there's a group of Nordic researchers that got together, headed up by a guy called Pete Kynes from the National Research Centre for the Working Environment in Copenhagen. And they've spent more than a decade now looking at this and looking at the factors that actually drive safety climate. And it'll come as no surprise to you that fundamentally it's been about the quality of leadership that's been exercised as to the outcome in terms of performance. I'm going to come to this in a little while, but performance in terms of lag and lead indicators. And so the way they have defined it, and it's very much in line with the literature, is they looked at safety climate at the level of a work crew, so a team. And they said that fundamentally, when you look at this, you're really looking at two things. You're looking at the perception both at an individual and group level around the commitment they see of management towards safety, and then secondly, how they view the safety-related policies, procedures and practices and requirements in terms of doing work. And when they looked at that and they compared what was happening for the Swedish operation as opposed to the Danish operation, what they saw fundamentally was a difference of opinion about those matters, even though in an object sense they were the same. So I want to talk to you a bit about this afternoon about how do you then go about building a high-performing safety culture and climate. And in a sense, this is an area that goes right back to the early 1980s. Often when we talk about safety culture from a leadership perspective, people tend to go straight to Chernobyl in 1986, and then there were a number of major disasters that took place following that. There was in 87, there was the King's Cross fire in London in the underground. Then tragically there was Piper Alpha the year after. And that really started the discussion around the primacy of safety culture in determining performance, and in particular decisions people were making around safety practices. And so one of the things that's been looked at extensively since then, and what I want to talk to you about this afternoon, is then the role the leader plays in influencing that culture. The other thing that's interesting is that if those who are interested in doing some reading, you'll know you've come across a guy called Dov Zohar, and Dov is an OHS academic in Israel, and he's done a whole lot of work, and he actually started in the early 1980s. So prior to Chernobyl, he was really wrestling through with this issue around what fundamentally makes a difference when it comes to performance. So the thing I want to talk with you about now is really around, if you're going to affect change, it's really about having clarity in terms of your change model. Fundamentally, what are you seeking to do? And this is really at the core of mindful safety leadership, is about this clarity. And as you can see there on the screen, you start at different places depending upon the climate and the culture you're working with. And it's really important as a mindful safety leadership cohort is to know, well, where are people in relation to that change model? And you can see there it starts with unaware. And so fundamentally you've got either leaders or work groups that are unaware of the problem or the issue at hand. And so fundamentally then the leader's challenge is to build awareness if that's the issue. And so it's about not only what the problem is, but it's about then the need to change. And it's about the why, which I'll come back to in a moment. The other aspect is about how then you go about motivating people. So they actually have the belief and the intention to change. And the interesting thing that's come out of the research as a primary predictor for a reduction in injuries and incidents is around the level of engagement or participation or empowerment of the workforce when it comes to safety. And part of the problem has been for us as leaders in this little legislative environment that we operate in. Often we drive, and we appropriately need to drive, a message of compliance. But that's really just getting to the starting line. So the focus on compliance is not something which can be wholesale. If people are familiar with Patrick Hudson's work of the evolutionary safety culture, you'll notice that the middle point in that ladder is about being calculative. It's about a focus on the safety management system. And Patrick argues very forcefully that's the starting point. I mean, below the line is reactive practices around safety, or even worse still, being pathological about who cares so long as you don't get caught. And he's saying that if you're going to move to being truly proactive and then moving to generative, where you set this high standard and the workforce is constantly seeking to take ownership to exceed that high standard, then primarily it's really a process of motivation. But the starting point clearly is that of compliance. And then it's really about the acts, it's about the behaviour, it's about people practicing the desired behaviours. And I'm going to come to that in terms of what a leader then defines as that. And then it's about how do you maintain it. And most importantly, how do we as leaders grow an ever larger pool of champions, or you will see there on the screen, advocates. Because in the end, sure, the frontline leader makes an enormous difference around participation and compliance, as does a senior manager in terms of the direction, strategic analysis, the resources that are set forth for the organisation. But fundamentally, it's really around worker on worker, and that's really the output of a mindful safety leadership. So if you say, well, look, have I arrived at the point of success? Part of that success is, have I actually increased the number of safety advocates within my direct field of influence? And you'll see there on the left, both Chris and I are realists and realise that people will relapse. And will relapse for all sorts of reasons, partly because they have simply overlooked something. There's been a reduction in situational awareness, through to a job was difficult to do, and there was that performance variability, and people went about to self-manage that and decided to operate outside what were the agreed approaches and behaviours. So I just want to suggest to you that if we're going to fundamentally as a leader bring about a change, it needs to start with a clarity of a change model. So the question I was going to ask you just to reflect on, and in a sense it's a bit hard because we can't be interactive, it would probably be good is to think about just what sort of model do we operate in when it comes to managing change in your organisation. The other thing that's probably fairly important is the issue of genuine participation, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But what's interesting is that really you can think about engagement as three distinct groups, and in a sense it's not hard and fast. You'll see there are dotted lines. There's a normal distribution curve because there's an acknowledgement that you will have people at either end, and the bulk of your people will be followers. And they're people that are about maintaining. They're people who are not necessarily advocates, but they'll do what's required. Then on either side we've got our safety champions, those who are the advocate, and clearly we have then those who are disbelievers. And I also want to draw your attention as a leader to the disbeliever. It's important to see that those people, sometimes we can discard them as being uninterested, unaware. The reality is often they're aware, simply we as leaders have failed to actually motivate them in being part of the safety process. And so often what we'll do, we'll spend lots of time as a leader doing more and more telling, but less and less of motivating and engaging them. So I think a helpful thing, if you are scribbling on a pad and taking some notes down, would be later on after this webinar is to spend some time reflecting on who makes up my work team that I'm trying to apply a change process to as this sort of mindful leader. Remembering mindful is both what works well, when is work difficult to do and why, and what can go wrong, is to actually have a think about where do people sit within these three areas, and in a sense, what is it that you're doing at the moment to increase the effectiveness and the number of your safety champions. The third aspect that has been seen as being really important is this notion of accountability and responsibility, and the fact that it's clearly defined. And part of the problem is when we talk with people, we use the terms interchangeably. We'll say, you know, everyone's accountable for safety, everyone's responsible for safety. Chris and I, in our work over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, have seen that organisations that fundamentally achieve exceptional safety performance are ones that can clearly distinguish between the difference of accountability and responsibility. So when we use the term for accountable, we're talking about the fact that people who are accountable, ultimately the end result of safety sits with them. Secondly, they have the authority and the power to change things because they're the ones who, in a sense, allocate resources. They're the ones who make the broader decisions. And then when it comes to performance, and in the sense of doing what's required, every person then exercises clarity and passion when they're motivated around their responsibilities. So again, it might be just useful to pause for a moment and to think about in your own organisation, and I know that we've got a wide cross-section of organisations across Australia with us this afternoon, is to think about that issue. And what I'd like you to do is not just think about yourself if you happen to be a health and safety professional. I'd like you to think about your organisational leaders. Do they understand their accountabilities for safety? And do they feel enabled by us as health and safety professionals through the tools and the system and the support we give them to actually exercise that accountability? So I want to move on now and just sort of move back into this issue of safety performance, and you'll see here that there are 3 things that need to interrelate. So clearly there is leadership, and what's interesting is that there's been some work done by a person called Sharon Clark, and she did a meta-analysis. She's from the UK, and in 2011 she did a global search for all the research that has dealt with safety, leadership, injuries, incidents, near miss. And what was interesting, she came up with probably, I think it was just short of 800 studies. And then they applied a criteria and they reduced that to probably about 100 studies that they actually looked at. And they did a qualitative and a quantitative analysis. So some of the things that Chris and I want to pull out and talk with you in a moment about this afternoon actually come from some of that research. And what's interesting that was found is that both a transactional and a transformational approach to leadership needed to be adopted. And what was interesting is that that could have a direct influence on safety performance, the middle circle, by what people actually do. So there's direct correlation between what a leader does then from that transactional and transformational space in terms of performance in the organisation as measured by what people actually do or don't do in regard to safety. They also found that there was a direct relationship between leadership and then the building of the overall climate of safety for that work crew. And obviously it also has an impact on safety culture, but that's a bigger, more macro picture. But if we go to the micro at the team or the department or the work crew level, and we say what's the climate, and remembering I'm defining climate as around the terms of perception of management's commitment and also around the workforce's perception of the safety policies, procedures and practices. The other really interesting thing that the research found is that the safety climate then influences the quality of the leadership. So it's actually a two-way process of influence. So I want to look now at leadership. So I've suggested to you that mindful safety leadership has these three qualities of what we're focusing on in terms of mindfulness. And the idea is by focusing on that, it then is going to drive the energy and effort around those three practices. And obviously it's going to change performance and improve the overall safety culture of the organisation. So if we have a look at what are the two T's then for inspirational leadership, fundamentally, you know, what is it that makes the difference? If we have a look at transformational leadership, there are four factors that need to be focused on. The first is that of basically the care factor. Are you as a leader, and I remember when I'm saying leader, I'm referring to us, because I gather as I look at the list here we have people who both are H&S and E leaders, and we also have here people who are operational leaders in their organisation, from senior executive through to the frontline leader. So in that span of leadership and covering those two areas, there are four things that we need to focus on as the mindful leader. The first is the care factor, and so fundamentally, do people in your span of control say that you care about them, that you're focused on their well-being, and how is it that you show that you have that as it were, that sort of leader empathy for them and their situation. The second factor is about the ability to inspire people, and it's not just for people to be, in a sense, inspired to be, say, safety's number one, safety's a core value. It's inspired to own. So it's actually to own two things. One is the actual requirements the system has for people to do, own in terms of also that of safety performance. The other aspect is really about the influencing to act. There's no point people saying, I own something, I think it's important, unless it can be an espoused value in terms of it's actually a lived value. It actually drives the activity and the action of what someone's doing. And then the fourth element is really around how do you, from a transformational point of view, get people to think and to solve the problem. And what's interesting is a number of the writers talk about this in terms of being intellectual stimulation. And if you think about it, often a lot of our people, when you tell them we're going to have a safety toolbox meeting, you're going to come to some sort of safety event, immediately it's greeted with this is going to be disengaging, it's going to be boring, it's going to tell me more of the same, etc. And what we fundamentally haven't done is we haven't engaged people with the capacity to think and to solve the problem, because the reality at the end of the day, regardless of where you sit in the organisation as a leader, most likely the person who's going to have the best solution to a problem is actually the person who's doing the job. They understand the performance variability. They understand what needs to be done to dampen that variability. They understand the notion of adaptive behaviour, and they can help you understand where the system both enables or adds other additional constraints that either don't add value or actually inadvertently introduce risk. So I want to come then just back to back to toolbox talks, because toolbox talks Chris and I see as not the only but a fundamental strategy in being able to improve genuine participation, engagement or empowerment by the workforce. So it might be useful just to think about this, and one of the things that's probably core to mindful safety leadership is really asking the question, what is being done? How does quantity stack up with quality? Because a lot of the stuff that we do as safety professionals or operational leaders around safety, we can get quantity right. we can set a metric, we can require people to do X of so many observations, so many inspections, close out actions in a certain time. But part of the problem is that doesn't then necessarily drive for quality outcomes. So it might be actually useful just again as a takeaway to reflect. When you think about your systems and procedures in your own organisation, to think through where you sit in terms of the quantity versus quality equation. And then I was at a recent safety conference, and I know some of you were there, and I asked the question, how many people had been in their career, had a responsibility at some point to run a toolbox talk or some form of a safety meeting that was designed to both impart information and engage people in a conversation around safety and to bring about change. And I would be fair to say in that room, and there was probably, I know, it was well over 250 people, there would have been 90% of the hands went up in the room and said, yep, I've had that. And I said, you can leave your hand up if at any point in your career you have had any form of mentoring or coaching in running a quality toolbox. And we all looked around the room, and I think, without exaggerating, I think we would have been lucky to find maybe 15 or 20 hands at most left up in the air. And yet we're saying that, you know, a principal mechanism for building engagement is through toolbox talks, yet really there's been little focus on the quality of those from the perspective of mentoring and coaching. The other T is really the transactional T. And one of the things I suppose that often causes Chris and I a bit of concern is that there's a whole lot of talk about transformation. You know, we need to inspire people. We've got to change people's hearts and minds. We've got to encourage people. We need people to be informed to act. And that is all absolutely critical. But if we only focus on that, we've only got one half, I think, of mindful safety leadership. The other half is really the transactional part. And if you've been reading lately in regard to that, it's often talked about in terms of contingent reward. And it's really about setting a standard, then monitoring, you know, people's performance against that standard, providing appropriate feedback, and there where people actually meet that standard is giving a recognition and reward. So the interesting thing I want to get you to think about is in this area of safety observations, I see that it has elements of being transformational because we're engaging in a conversation, but also it's about transactional. It's one of those opportunities that we get to engage with people doing the task and have a look at how does the system play out. And again, I want to ask you the question, in your organisation when it comes to this issue of safety observation, is the focus around the quantity piece, you know, completing so many, having so many tiered or whatever, or is it around that and, because it's not an either or, and a quality focus about that conversation? And I want to suggest to you, and Chris and I often ask people this question when we're talking with them in the workplace, how they would rate the quality of those interactions. And it'd be probably fair to say we get a fairly mixed account. And a lot of people see it, again, through the lens of compliance, through a quantity focus. So, well, my manager or our leaders are doing this because they're required to do it. Or really it's just about finding out when we've done something wrong and telling us about it. It's really just a metric about what's safe versus unsafe behaviour. And so it really doesn't enter into. So when Chris and I think about quality, it's really about what's the nature of the conversation. Are people able to explain what they're doing from a perspective of safe versus unsafe? Can people enter into a dialogue around what they're mindful of, particularly about what might go wrong in that task? And as it were, what controls are they relying on in order to work safely? And how have they, in the course of the shift, How have they determined that those controls that they're relating to and relying on are effective? So I just want to get you to think about that. Again, I know because we're not interactive, but I'm imagining as you're sitting and listening, there are probably things turning around your own mind about observations. And I really just want to draw our attention to the fact that this is, I think, one of the primary transaction tools that we have to bring about a performance improvement. So I want to talk to you about safety in a box, and the person who's come up with this is actually not myself. It came from Chris Darling, and I think Chris one day was sort of sitting on a plane, as you do when you do a long international flight, musing about how can I help people understand the notion of requirement and leadership, and how do we actually help people, because variability is always there, boundaries are flexible, that's the nature of work, and we can't necessarily proceduralise everything that is done in a day. So how can we get people to think about safety in a way which is simple? And Chris and I have used this model now for many organisations, and it'd be probably fair to say the feedback we've got has been really positive. So I only just want to show you, mainly because of time, just a bit of a snapshot of this, and maybe it might help prompt some thinking for yourself. So it basically starts with a box, and I want to get you to think about this. It's the box that we see, and you'll see there on the screen, it's not a solid box. It's got a couple of, you might describe as fairly gaping holes in that box. And the reality is often when it comes to boundaries and safety, that's often how it is. It's not necessarily well defined. And so it is very difficult then from a transactional perspective of safety observations. It's difficult to ask people from a transformational point of view to own something when it's not clear what they're being asked to own and what we're asking them to do from an inspired act perspective. So I want you to think about, how clear is the box? Think about some of the maybe the critical risks that are in your organisation. It might be things like confined space, working at heights, people and vehicle interactions. It might be falling objects. It can be a raft of things. I want you to think about, how clear is that box when it comes to the boundaries? And then maybe think about the more everyday tasks that people do. What's the clarity that we've given people, and have we given it in such a way that it's also workable? So in a sense, if we think about the box, a way of understanding this metaphor, it's really these standards that we're setting. It's obviously importantly it's defined by the behaviours, and it's very clear about the performance aspects. And in a sense, you can see this comes back to this notion of accountability. It's really about here where managers have clearly defined it, both for employees and contractors. And what we're trying to do is engage people to work within and to follow that. The reality often happens is that things can be seen to be acceptable, and that's what happens in the box. And clearly when we operate outside the box, the thing is deemed to be unacceptable. So I want to talk to you about defining the box and why it's critical. And again, if you're taking notes, feel free to jot this down. I want to work our way through this. The first thing about defining the box from a mindful safety leadership perspective is really giving people the why. In a sense, why has this boundary put in place? And it is not a didactic why, it's a why that engages people in discussion. And I think if we have our primary focus as being merely compliance, what we'll do a lot of telling, and we'll wonder why then other adults don't buy in and take ownership. So I want to suggest to you that if you're going to get clarity around the box, you need to engage people in the why. The other reason why it's important to engage people in the why is you might discover that in that there are a number of things that haven't been considered. As you've exercised your accountability as this mindful safety leader, there are a number of things that you weren't aware of. It's also important because even, and Chris and I have worked in some fairly probably be fair to describe as adversarial workplace environments. Even in those environments where people might be inclined to want to enter into fairly healthy and robust debate, if they've been given the why, even though they might necessarily at one level implicitly agree with it, they will follow it because they now understand the reasoning behind it. The next is the what. So we need to be very clear about what is it I'm actually asking of you to do. And then how. So how will this be done? And then finally, and you can see again this ties back the circle to this observation process of verification. So how is it that we ensure that these boundaries are both effective and in place? And part of the problem is often, let's say after an incident has happened, there will be a number of additional controls put in place. And what's interesting is that the research has shown 12 months pass by and a large amount of those controls are either not in place or their effectiveness has been diminished. So if we want to be able to be clear about this, then we need to be able to say why the box is here, what it's about, how I want you to implement it, and then obviously the verification piece is the boundaries about why it's there and I need to verify it. Now, what happens if people then obviously operate in the box? Well, when people operate in the box, it's not just about giving people a movie ticket. It's not about giving them some form of a cash prize. I mean, and I know that's a hotly contested point, but it's actually about recognising people, and it's about caring for them and actually loving them and acknowledging them as they acceptably operate within that box. It's also being aware that often those boundaries will need to be reviewed, considered, and it's about engaging with them in a way that's respectful in that discussion. But following on from that is we really have to ask ourselves the fundamental question, are our leaders encouraging people to work inside of the box? And it also raises the question, what do we need to do when people are actually operating outside the box? Let me give you an example for a moment. We've got a team of, let's say, 8 people working on a shift in a particular area of our operation. And we've got one person who's electing to operate outside the box. I mean, you've got to ask yourself the question, if I don't do anything about that, what's that then say about the standard and the behaviour that's been set? And, a number of people will use the phrase, the thing I've walked past is the new standard I've just set. So clearly, what Chris and I would actually be very clear about is that we need to think about consequence management. So we need to be able to think through what is the just and fair framework in our organisation for dealing with that? Because as James Reason talks about, error can be intended or unintended. We need to be clear about that. We also need to be clear about what drove that behaviour, and that needs to feature in our response. But let's say now in that particular crew, I've got 4 or 5 people who are now following that particular deviation, operating outside the box when the box has been made clear and accountability has been exercised by the leader. Then you need to think through, well, what then happens there? Now, can I suggest to you that if you've got half a team that's doing that, it would be a reasonable conclusion to draw that the team leader, the frontline supervisor, is probably aware of that. And let's say now in an organisation we start to talk a bit more about the broader safety culture. We've now got 3 or 4 teams operating like that. We've got 3 or 4 team leaders or frontline leaders in that position. Would it be fair to then step up the next level and say, well, probably that operational manager is aware of what's happening and has taken no action? And I want to suggest to you that in that situation, it's not about consequence management. It's really about performance management. It's about, in that next performance conversation, having that tough conversation with that leader, because in a sense they have allowed that to happen. Now we'll find all sorts of reasons, and those reasons will often diminish once looked at, really are excuses. At the fundamental end of it, it's really about the leader has knowingly allowed that to happen. They have the clarity and accountability, they're exercising mindfulness, so they're aware of it, and they've not detected the early warning sign, and they've not taken action. So what they've ended up doing is actually endorsing the behaviour. So it'd be an interesting thing just for you to reflect again in your own organisation. Where do your leaders sit in respect to that? Are they actively encouraging or not? So the last thing I want to do is just really get you to maybe think about this issue of safety performance, and you know, how do you actually measure safety performance? And I wrote a recent article about lag and lead indicators, and clearly, you know, lag indicators have a place in terms of tracking all incident, all injury rates, lost time injuries, injury severity, but they tell you something, and we obviously know that after the event. Lots of organisations have wrestled through how do you adopt positive or lead indicators that drive future activity, future improvements, and a different set of behaviours around safety. And I just want to suggest to you there are many ways in which you can sort of think this through, but I want to take you back to where I sort of started this presentation, this webinar, was around safety climate. And there were 7 things that they found out, and this is the group of Nordic researchers that need to be thought about. So maybe if you're jotting notes again, you might want to think, how's our organisation tracking at the moment in these 7 areas as a lead measure, and how does that then relate to the lag? Because often what we'll do, we'll say, look, you know, lead measures are really important, but I want to ask you, the litmus test is when you have an incident, what's the default position? Do you go back straight to the lag indicator and focus on that, or do you take account of that but then drive forward on your lead indicator? So the first thing I thought might be interesting for you to think about as a lead indicator, as a mindful safety leader, is safety commitment of the leader. And how is it that you currently measure that? What's your metrics around that as an organisation? How do you track that? And once again, is it a quantity? And that's a good place, by the way, to start. But do you follow it up then with a quality measure? Because what's interesting in the research, and if I take you back to Sharon Clark that I was referring to earlier on, and there was another group in New York that did a similar study, when they looked at all the research around safety leadership, they said the #1 common agreement factor that made a difference around behaviour and performance in safety was that of the manager or leaders demonstrated or displayed safety commitment. The second area that might be worth thinking about, how do you measure as a lead indicator, is around safety empowerment or participation or engagement. So a great spot to start there is engaging people in the workforce to give you feedback without fear or favour about the effectiveness of your toolbox talk meetings, and to ask them about how we're going in that regard. Leader safety justice, just and fairness, how is that deemed as a lead indicator? Again, really useful, because we know that that will drive things underground if it's not handled, or non-reporting. If you thought about maybe measuring leader safety commitment as well as worker safety commitment, and looking at how you might track that as a lead indicator over a period of, say, 6 to 12 months. It would be also useful to think about worker safety priority and non-acceptance of risk. And again, how you might measure that can be some simple surveying processes, or again some metrics that come out of the observation process in your organisation. Another measure is around communication, learning and trust. And what's interesting here, it's not just trust of the worker with management, it's also the trust between co-workers drives safety performance. And then the last thing, and particularly for those who are sitting in on this webinar as health and safety professionals, is the interesting thing about the efficiency and efficacy of our safety management systems that we put in place for our organisations. I mean, do we actually build them a car that's easy to drive and operate down the highway of operational tasks? And if we can actually measure people's trust and their, if you like, their value proposition in the safety management system, and that's seen as being positive, again, we know obviously that's going to drive us up that safety culture ladder I was talking about early on, back towards proactive and generative, because people will now take ownership for the actual system itself. So finally, I want to open to questions, and so I can see a couple of questions there already. So what I thought I might do is I'll have a look at the questions as they come up, and I've just taken off the screen so I can see the questions, and then what I'll do is I'll just work my way through the questions. So can you feel free to either put it in as a question or as chat, and let me see if I could, thank you too, I can see everyone who said I can hear, which is really helpful. So we're just scrolling down the questions now and seeing if you've got any specific questions. So I can see one question, and let me just see if I can take that one up. The question is, how do you know where you sit as an organisation in the model? I gather you might be referring to the model of the ladder. So I'll take it as that, but if you want to add some more to that question, then feel free to. I think one of the ways in which you can see where you sit within that safety culture ladder is two things. One is be really useful to engage workforce in a simple series of questions to give you feedback on that. We've actually done that across a number of organisations. You describe each of the types, and you simply ask people to do two things. One, where do they see the organisation operating most often in? That's the first question. And the second question, can you give me a couple of examples that sort of help me understand how you see that? The other way is actually having a look at your lag indicator data and seeing what's happening with your injury and incident rate, and particularly how that's being managed, and having that discussion at a leadership team. When we see that data, do we respond in a reactive way, it's knee-jerk, or are we proactive? Do we actually put a strategy in place? Do we put a plan in place, and do we then manage to that plan? And are we actually searching out for things that we don't yet know in our organisation? So is there any other questions that people have? And what I thought I might do, if you haven't as yet, I've got two poll questions I'd like to launch and just ask you. So I hope it works at your end. So the first poll I've got for you, I would rate our organisation's mindful safety leadership as. So if you want to lock in your vote at your end, and you'll see there that you've got a number of options: exceptional, above average, average, and below average. And in the spirit of complete transparency, I hope I can bring the screen back on. No, I'm being told by my technical operator no. So let me tell you what the results have just come up, which is really interesting. A few people are still locking in your votes. Excellent. Well, let me tell you what the result is. We have 18% who said above average. So in today's teleconference and webinar, we've got 1 in 5 saying ours is above average. We have 42% that say average, and then 37% below average. So what I want to ask you to do with those numbers in mind, if you've got above average, can I ask you to think through what is it that we're doing well that we need to focus even greater attention and energy on to improve? For those who said average, it'd be really useful to work out in your own mind what's driving that average performance. And if you could change maybe one or two things, what would the one or two things be that you'd change? And then below average, can I suggest with that, and I know this is getting a little bit personal, could I ask you maybe in the below average to think about who are the one or two people in your mind that fall into that category that you believe you need to take on some actual real direct coaching to improve. Because as we've said, if we allow below average safety leadership to continue, we know what's going to happen is that people will probably not operate within that safety box. Can I ask you a second question in the poll, and then I'll come back and see what further questions have come in that I'll try and answer. So the next question I've got for you, would you say that your leaders in your organisation have a clear understanding of their safety accountabilities? So it'd be useful just to see what you think in regard to that. Are they clear about their accountabilities? Remembering again that that's going to drive the quality and the focus of your safety leadership. So thanks. I can see the votes coming in. So what I'll do is I'll just wait for a second longer. And then what we'll do, we'll go back to the last sort of 5 minutes of our time together for further questions. So